sexual behavior, and attachment styles. To kind of be my intro into my presentation, I definitely want to show this clip that I found to be very influential and also a true representation of how children can be impacted by the absence or inconsistency of the relationship with their father. So I just want to show that first.
You a better man than me? Yeah. Now you can tell Will or not. I'm not gonna do your dirty work for you. Fine. I'll call him from the road. Yeah, why don't you do that? Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah. What's up? Will, I'm glad you're here. Some business came up I gotta handle. So we're gonna have to put our trip on hold. You understand? Yeah, that's cool. Just for a couple of weeks. I understand. Yeah. Maybe a little longer. Yeah, whatever. Look, I'll call you next week and we'll iron out the details. Okay? Yeah. It was great seeing you, son. You too, Lou. Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, it actually just works out better for me. You know, as slummies as summer come to class right next to that, you know? Well, it's all right to be angry. Hey, well, why should I be mad? I'm saying, at least he said goodbye this time. I just wish I hadn't wasted my money buying a stupid present. I'm sorry. You know, if there was something that I... Hey, you know what? You ain't gonna do nothing. Like, you know, ain't like I'm still 5 years old, you know? Ain't like I'm gonna be sitting up every night asking my mom, when's daddy coming home, you know? Who needs him? Hey, he wasn't there to teach me how to shoot my first basket, but I learned, didn't I? Hey, I got pretty damn good at it too, didn't I, Phil? Got through my first date without him, right? I learned how to drive, I learned how to shave, I learned how to fight without him. I had 14 great birthdays without him. He never even sent me a damn card. To hell with him! I ain't need him then and I don't need him now. Well, now, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna get through college without him. I'm gonna get a great job without him. I'm gonna marry me a beautiful honey, and I'm having a whole bunch of kids. I'm gonna be a better father than he ever was. And I sure as hell don't need him for that, because ain't a damn thing he can ever teach me about how to love my kids. How come you don't want me, man?
And I wanted to share that particular clip because I think it's a true kind of representation of some of the emotions that adolescents can feel when they're dealing with the inconsistencies, the absence, you say you're going to do one thing but something else happens or something else is always more important or always comes up. So I think in this thing, that emotion of them trying to push through and still do everything they wanted to do in their lives, even though this particular absence was in their lives. So I just wanted to kind of share that to kind of put a picture to everything else that will be discussed today. So going into just the purpose and significance of my study, the purpose is basically to just examine the impact of fatherlessness on the areas of academic achievement, delinquent behavior, sexual behavior, and attachment style. And when I look at the significance, I definitely want to look at how it's impacting gender and also race. And I think for me working in the schools, knowing how this could impact the children that I'll be working with, it would be great in order to establish different interventions or possible programs that would be beneficial to kind of help with this potential hurdle that they may be facing when they're dealing with the absent father. So the research questions that were addressed was basically, does fatherlessness affect academic achievement, delinquent behavior, sexual behavior, and attachment styles among undergraduate students? And then the second two questions are looking at those same variables while controlling for gender, and then also while controlling for race and ethnicity. So looking at father absence or fatherlessness, and I kind of use those terms interchangeably throughout the paper and throughout my presentation, I'm looking at 4 main categories of father relationship. So you're looking at the residential father active, so the father's living in the home, he's very active in the lives of his children. Residential father not active, he's living in the home but doesn't have a real relationship or interacting with his children. Non-residential father and active, so he's living outside of the home but he's active in the lives of his children. And then absent father, no relationship, so there's absolutely no relationship and he's not present at all in their lives. And when I looked at the research, and I took Coley and Chase, Lansdale, and then also Park, looked at different components of father involvement. So direct interaction with their child. Are they interacting? Are they doing things with their child? Is it, some hobbies being taken care of together, doing homework together, things like that. Being available for their children. If the child needs something emotionally, from homework to going out to play baseball, is the father available to be there for their child? And then last one, being able to manage the necessities. So food, shelter, clothes for their children. And additional research has found that 40% of fathers who are involved or are involved on an inconsistent basis from birth to preschool. And that's looking at fathers who are not in the home. So there's an inconsistency there. And when we look at reasons for absence, there's several reasons that could be the reasons for absence in the home. So it could be jail, there's death in the Army, so they may be in and out, and so there's inconsistency there. They may be in the home, but they're working, so they don't have that relationship. So that kind of goes back to the residential, non-active father role. Or they're in the home, and there could be other variables like mental illness or substance abuse that they're present, but they're not emotionally present or available for their child. As we look deeper into academic achievement, for single-parent homes, children from single-parent homes are twice as likely to drop out of high school. And they're exposed to other things like violence, poverty, and unemployment, but fatherlessness seems to be one of the common factors for the dropout rates for high school. And then also for involved parents, so if both mother and father are involved in the lives of their child, there is more academic success. And academic success based on the McBride article in 2009 addresses having higher grades and less suspensions from school. So you're showing some success there in your abilities to achieve academically. When we look at father involvement, when they're involved, they're more likely to be involved with child care or home-based education programs. So they're helping build things in the home, so they're not relying on just the school system to provide the academic growth for their child. They're being more involved in the home as well. And they're the primary influence for academic achievement, based on an article by Rodney and Premier in 1999. But even non-residential fathers, if they're not in the home, but they're still active and they're involved, that still shows some growth in their academic success. So when looking at delinquent behavior, delinquency is basically defined as any negative behavior. And there is an overrepresentation in the data that children from fatherless homes are involved in more delinquent acts. And this can range from drug trafficking to substance abuse. And for adolescent males, it tends to be more violent interactions that they're engaged in as opposed to adolescent females. Well, an article by Mackey and Mackey addresses that one way to reduce the delinquency is for males to kind of work on that attachment with their parents, while females tend to have more of attachment with their peers. It declines. It causes a decrease in their delinquency. Next, we have sexual abuse, and again, children from homes with absent fathers or inconsistent fathers have a higher risk of early sexual activity and adolescent pregnancy. And they're twice as likely for girls to become teen mothers themselves. Additionally, looking for adolescent girls who live without their fathers, they tend to be more sexually active, which includes having sexual thoughts, being sexually permissive, and also having negative thoughts towards condoms. However, even though they may have these thoughts and these behaviors, they are more cautious when it comes to non-sexual risk. So while they're risky in one area, they're a little bit more cautious when it comes to their behaviors in other areas. And also for females, we tend to, and I'll address this in my predictions, to see that girls are more sexually active than boys, but we all kind of are aware that girls tend to, have the visual burden when they have sexually active if they become pregnant. So you can see that they've been sexually active if they become pregnant, but you don't see that same type of visual representation from males. Next, as we look at attachment, there was very little research for attachment with looking at fatherlessness with these with the other variables. So I really feel like this study kind of helps with filling in the gap with that particular area. But the focus of this particular area is looking at the research of the attachment theory by Ainsworth from 1978. And it talks about attachment being the bond between two people that causes an emotional reaction when they're apart or they're together. And there are three main areas of attachment. So we have secure attachment, insecure avoidant attachment, and an insecure ambivalent or resistant attachment. And with secure attachment, we're looking at the relationship, and again with these, we're looking more at babies as opposed to adolescents. But they're confident with their parent, that their parent will be there when they need them. They know that if anything happens, that their parent will be there. For insecure avoidant, they're both emotionally and physically independent of their parent, and they don't seek comfort. And insecure ambivalent, the children could be clingy or needy, but also reject their parent at the same time. So we see the different variations of the different types of attachment there. So next, when we look at race and ethnicity, the chart that I have here just shows a breakdown from a study that I found by Thomas and Farrell in 1996. It kind of gives a breakdown of children in single parent homes by race. So this circle here, this part here is African American at 25%. We have here Caucasians at 36%, Hispanics here, and then you have other here. And Caucasian children, again, when we look at the other variables, tend to engage in more drug use or alcohol use, while African American children do tend to interact with more violent delinquency or drug trafficking. However, one thing that was very interesting to me was that for African Americans and Caucasians, the fathers tend to be more in contact with in African American families as opposed to Caucasian families. So again, as we look at gender, when it comes to learning gender roles, it's kind of a cultural thing. We kind of learn what to do as girls and what to do as boys based on the examples that are set forth. However, as society has changed and become more modern, those roles have kind of shifted. And when the father is absent or inconsistent in the home, the children aren't able to get a true depiction of what's considered a masculine role or a feminine role. So what we have here is when fathers are absent, there's a poor sense of masculinity for males. They don't have, in some cases, they don't have that example of what a man's supposed to do. And for females, because they may, again, have that absent father in the home, they sometimes they become more masculine based on other examples that they have. And so they're not seeing they're not seeing roles in the home, so they're kind of copying or mimicking things that they see in other areas. As also for the emotional impact, daughters, in most cases, females tend to be a little bit more emotional than males. So for this one, it wasn't very surprising to me that for the emotional impact, the daughters struggle with their fathers being absent. They don't understand why they're absent, and they can grow to be angry or hostile when it comes to the relationship with their father or also the relationship with other men. So here are my predictions of what I'm assuming to find based on the research and things that I've seen in the field, is that for college students, academic achievement will kind of be the same across the board as far as the variables of father being present or absent. Because again, with the population being undergraduate students, they've achieved some academic success already by making it to this level. For males, will display more delinquent behavior, while females will express more sexual behavior. And then lastly, I'm predicting there will be no difference among racial groups for attachment. So moving into the method section, basically how everything was collected. For my design, it was a quantitative study, and it was retrospective. So the survey that was given to the students, they were asked to answer the questions based on the time frame being between 13 and 17, so kind of capturing those adolescent years. And I felt that was important because with my focus wanting to be working in the schools, I kind of wanted to see how these variables were impacted during that age group. And being an undergraduate student, you're not too far removed from being an adolescent, so it kind of worked. For the independent variable, we have father absence. And again, we're categorizing it based on, based on these four categories I mentioned before. So residential father active, residential father not active, non-residential father active, and then absent father no relationship. As far as the dependent variables, we have academic achievement, delinquent behavior, sexual behavior, and also attachment styles, with the covariates being race and ethnicity and also gender. And again, the participants were male and female undergraduate students, 18 years of age or older. So to look specifically at the measures that were used, these are the first three. So starting off with the demographic questionnaire, which basically just gathers that basic information needed, so age, race, gender, sexual orientation. It also goes into the family setup. So who was living in your home between the ages of 12 and 18? If your father or mother were absent, who was your male or female role model who filled in that primary father figure role or primary mother figure role? Next, we looked at network or relationship, and while this was not this addresses basically the relationship between the participant and their father, and while this was not a variable that was used in the overall MANOVA, I found it to be very important to include because I wanted to see not only if your father was absent, how was the relationship with the father. So kind of looking at that as well. Next, we have the student engagement in school measure, which is used for my academic achievement variable, which measures basically the affective, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions of the student's engagement in school. Next, we have the late adolescent delinquency scale, which addresses delinquent behavior in late adolescents and the number of times they've engaged in those different behaviors. We have the sexual knowledge and sexual behavior questionnaire, which again, it looks at their sexual knowledge and behavior and the age of first engaging in different behaviors and how often. And then last, we have the inventory of parent and peer attachment. So it examines the attachment style of the participant and how they engaged with during adolescence with their father. So then this gives just an overall picture of how the study was run. So I did use a MANOVA to address the questions that were used. So again, we have fatherlessness here as the independent variable with our dependent variables here. And again, I used the MANOVA because my fatherlessness variable is categorical, so it has the four categories, and these other measures are continuous, so it allows me to see how those variables were going to interact. And then again, for my covariate for gender, again, still addressing fatherlessness with these dependent variables, but then looking specifically on how it impacts males and females for each one. And then the same for race. So fatherlessness, dependent variables, and then the races here. And I included more races than what was in the original chart that I showed you because I had more participants who kind of were able to share their input on the particular survey. So we have African Americans, Caucasians, Hispanics, Asian Pacific, Middle Eastern, Native American, and also biracial in other for not classified. So moving on to my actual hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is basically there is going to be no significant effect on fatherlessness on academic achievement, delinquent behavior, sexual behavior, or attachment style. My hypothesis, the second hypothesis, there will be no significant effect on fatherlessness on those variables when controlling for race and ethnicity. And then the last hypothesis is again, no significant effect on fatherlessness on those variables when controlling for gender. And I wanted to kind of disprove these hypotheses. I wanted to see, while my predictions are kind of saying that there will be a difference, I'm hypothesizing that there may not be a difference, but I wanted to, so as noted in my predictions, I predict that there will be a significant difference for certain variables when looking for race and gender. So we look at our descriptive variables, and the committee do have a chart that actually has this information that you can look at and reference. I have this chart here that looks at the breakdown for race. So a large group of my participants were African Americans, 67.2%, 15.6% were Caucasian, 0.8% for Asian Pacific, and also for Native American, 4.9% for Middle Eastern, 7.4% for biracial. And then looking at for gender, again, a large overrepresentation of females, in my study, so 82% were female, 17.2% were male. And overall, there were 122 participants used for this study. So again, just noting and kind of keeping in mind that I found it interesting when trying to control for race and gender, with an overrepresentation of African Americans and an overrepresentation of females, seeing that depiction in the results. Kind of, it'll come. So looking at my overall data analysis, again, I'm a fan of figures. So we have our relationship with fatherlessness here, so those 4 categories, and then our dependent variables listed here with the measures that were used. So again, with the MANOVA being used for father absence with those 4 dependent variables, there was actually a significant statistical difference. So the father being absent does impact the participant when you look at all of those categories collectively. And when we look at specifically for race and gender, again, as I noted before with the overrepresentation of females and African Americans, there was no significant difference. However, and I'll address this again, if there was a more even distribution of gender and race, seeing if there would be a difference in that statistical outcome with a more diverse population sample. So once I looked at everything collectively, I kind of wanted to see how fatherlessness would impact each category individually. So I kind of broke it down from here, looking at all of the variables and measures that were used. So first, looking at the network of relationship inventory, this was the one that looked at the relationship with the father and the quality of the relationship. And there were 10 categories, but they're kind of combined to make 2 main categories that were used, so positive qualities and then negative qualities. And these were the 7 categories that kind of go into positive. So looking at compassion, intimate disclosure, instrumental aid, nurturance, reassurance of work, reliable alliance, and then also affection. And then for negative qualities, looking at conflict and antagonism. So with the MANOVA that was run for this, because our 2 scores for the positive qualities and negative qualities were continuous variable, I used the MANOVA again to analyze the significance of this part of the question, and there was a significant difference. So based on the relationship with the father, it would impact the quality of the relationship. And again, there was no significant difference when controlling for race and gender. So when we look here at the actual chart, it kind of puts all the numbers together. We have here the 4 categories, and then the orange lines are our positive characteristics, and then the red is our negative. And you see the common here is that for residential active, and then for non-residential active, the positive outweigh the negative. So if your father is active in your life, then there's more of a positive outlook as opposed to a negative outlook on the relationship with the father. And it's the opposite for those who are not active. So residential, not active, and then non-residential relationship is the opposite. So there's more negative, a higher negative score than is for positive score based on the lack of relationship or lack of activity between the father and the child. And then also looking more specifically at gender, again, having those same categories here, looking here for males and then for females. Due to the lower amount of males used, I didn't have anybody to kind of fall into this residential not active role. But interestingly enough, for here, no matter the situation, the positive outweigh the negative in each of the categories that we have here. And then for females, again, similar to overall, for those who have a positive relationship with their father, either residential or non-residential, the positive outweigh the negative. So this is a close representation of the overall comparison of everyone. And then next is to look at the racial comparisons. And again, for some of these, I only had 1 participant, so it wasn't the best representation. But if we look here at this red line for African Americans, and then this orange line, no, that's backwards. orange line is African Americans, the red line is Caucasian. For those two where we had a representation in each group, you can see the variation in scores. It's very consistent, even though the scores are a little lower here, but it does kind of go lower here and higher. So we're seeing a higher score for active and then lower peaks for the non-active for the positive side. And then again, it's the kind of the reverse over here. It kind of goes, the negative goes up when the father is not active, and then down when they're active. So next, as we move on to fatherlessness and academic achievement, again, we have the student engagement in school measure that was used, looking at effective behavior and cognitive engagement, and we also use GPA in this variable as well, just to kind of make it a more robust variable. And again, there was no significant difference in the father being absent or present and how they achieved academically. And the same for race and gender. And again, considering that the population is current undergraduate students, they've already established some level of academic achievement because they are in college. Next, let's look at fatherlessness and delinquent behavior. Again, addressed using the late adolescent delinquency scale. I used a NOVA for this particular measure because delinquencies only had one measure, one score, as opposed to the other ones that had multiple scores to look at. But again, there was no significant difference between father absence and the delinquent behavior here. And again, same for race and gender. No covariance was found for those as well. So originally in my predictions, I noted that I was predicting that males would, engage in more delinquent behavior compared to females. And while this looks like a major gap in leap from male to female, the scores for this range from 16 to 66. So then if you consider that, this 0.8 difference, overall looking at from 16 to 66, it really isn't that big of a difference of delinquency between male and female based on this population. So then when we look at fatherlessness with sexual behavior, again, using the sexual behavior and knowledge variable, again, no significant difference was found for this measure. And to use the variables that I used for this, this particular measure did not have questions that they could come up with an overall score. So I used the age of the first time that they had sex, the first time they've engaged in oral sex, and kind of average that out to make a continual variable to kind of get these scores, or this ANOVA. So if we look here at this particular chart, I predicted in my earlier that females would engage in more sexual behavior or at an earlier age. And when we look here for males, so this red line is the first time that they engaged in sex, and then for males, the first average age was 16.24 for males. For females, it was 16.73. So they're engaging in sex on an average about the same age. And then for this line, which is for oral sex, it's 11.3 for males, 11.38 for females for the average age of first engaging in oral sex. So again, there was no variation between male and female based on the average of when they're engaging in these behaviors for the first time. So next, when we look at fatherlessness and attachment, again, using the inventory for parent and peer attachment, this breaks down into three main scoring categories, which is the degree of mutual trust, the quality of communication, and then the extent of anger and of alienation. And I used a ANOVA for this one as well, and there was a significant difference for this one. So therefore, it's kind of showing that when the father presence in the home or is active in their lives does impact the way they attach to their father in that relationship. But however, as assumed in my predictions, there was no covariance, so there was no impact based on race or gender. So then looking at that a little bit more, we have, again, looking at it on those 4 categories. The orange line is trust, the red line is communication, and then this tannish color line is alienation. So for trust and communication, we're seeing those peaks. When the father, so the higher the score, higher the score is, hold on 1 second. Yeah, so the higher the score, the more they have areas of concern for those particular things. So for trust and for communication, we see the peaks here of higher scores for those who are not active or not on the relationship was there. So if for residential active, they're lower scores, so we're seeing that they're not as big of a concern for areas of trust and for communication here. And then for alienation, we kind of see a consistent across the board for that particular score. So looking at the overall summary of results, there was significant difference for the overall MANOVA, so looking at fatherlessness with all 4 variables. However, there was no significant effect in controlling for race and for gender. And again, specifically looking at the 4 categories separately, no significant difference for the first 3 variables, no covariance for any of the variables, but then we do have a significant difference here for attachment style. And then again, as we look at the relationship, the network of relationship inventory, we did have a significant difference there with covariance, with no covariance for gender and race. So looking at my hypothesis results, for our first hypothesis was rejected. So there was a significant, I hypothesized there would be no significant effect, but there was a significant effect when looking at fatherlessness with academic achievement, delinquent behavior, sexual behavior, and attachment style. However, the other 2 hypotheses were accepted as there was no significant effect when you control for race or control for gender. So we kind of go back and compare this to the literature and how this study kind of compares to what was already out there. We see that relationships with fathers can impact the child's learning and impact their adjustment. But since these were college students that were participants, it can be assumed that it's an indicator that the father, regardless of the relationship with the father, they've achieved academically because they've made it. They're in college, they're working on their degree, so they were able to kind of overcome that high school hurdle of graduating and making it to this next point. And also 64% of the participants in this study had a 3.0 or higher. However, there was no, and I kind of tried to look at GPA with the other measure, the school student engagement school measure. There was no real pattern of based on GPA you had higher scores for behavior or cognitive, but it was just very interesting to see that a majority of the participants had a 3.0 or higher currently. Also, looking more at academic achievement, when you expand the sample and you kind of consider looking at those who didn't complete high school, or maybe those who took alternate routes after high school, how if we had a more diversified sample, if that would have made a difference in the academic achievement variable, as opposed to just having undergraduate students, what if there were more variety in the population? Next, for delinquent behavior, this study's findings don't support the research that an absent father will significantly impact delinquent behavior. But again, since we're looking at a participant pool of undergraduate students, it could be, that could be an impact on the delinquent behavior. Because you're achieving academically, you may not have time to engage in delinquent behavior, or you kind of gave up those ways when you were in high school, because now you're in, you moved on. So because of the population pool that we're focusing on, that could have been an indicator of why that score was not significant. So again, if we had a different population pool to pick from, maybe students who have been, in trouble with the law, or having gone to college, having some more diversity in the population pool could again have shown some variation in this score. again, looking at sexual behavior, the lack of father involvement does increase sexual thoughts, permissiveness, and negative thoughts towards condoms we've addressed before. But again, we saw consistency in the scores for males and females as far as when they first engaged in sex, in the ages that they engaged in sex. So this study did find that the absence of father did not significantly impact sexual behavior. So it doesn't support the previous studies that were saying that sexual behavior was impacting sexual activity. I mean, father absence was impacting sexual activity. Next, when we look at attachment, the original theory of attachment styles, looking at secure, insecure, avoidant, and resistant attachments, I kind of tried to line those up with the 3 variables that were used for the measure. So mutual trust seemed to line up the most with secure attachment. Quality of communication kind of fit with insecure, avoidant in a way that, yes, you could communicate with your father, but there still may be some voids in your ability to kind of know that they would be there all the time when you need them, even though you are able to communicate. And then the extent of anger and alienation seem to line up the most with the resistant attachment style. And again, attachment is the only variable that has statistically significant difference. And again, if your father is absent or absent and not, there to really form a relationship with you, it's kind of hard to form an attachment to someone who is not there or inconsistently there. Next, again, looking at gender and ethnicity, culture may impact the beliefs and expectations of non-residential fathers. If your culture believes that it's okay for the father to be working and just providing for your home, and that's the way he shows he loves you and he cares about you, then that may, it may be okay for him to not be emotionally there if that's what your culture is accepting of. So that's something to really keep in mind when looking at these different variables. What are the cultural expectations on things? Expectations for males and females are very different, and they vary from birth to now. And we learn different things based on examples. So again, as we talked before, you kind of learn your gender roles based on examples. And your first example is your parents. So we learned those expectations. So this study was kind of inconsistent with the previous work that there was no significant difference was found for these variables. So one of the benefits for kind of examining all of these together is that there's really very little research out there that kind of looks at all of them. They kind of look at, delinquency and sexual behavior or academics and delinquency, but there was nothing that looked at all 4 of them combined. And as we noticed from the results, there was a significant difference in how a father's presence in the home can impact those variables collectively. So again, looking deeper into the fatherlessness in relationships, again, I mentioned this was very relevant to the study because it's still important to see, even if the father is absent, how do you still see, or not in the home but active, how do you still see your relationship? Is it still a relationship that is of importance and of quality to you? And here's just overall look at those, again, the same charts before, showing the residential active is higher for positive for both male, for both residential, for active fathers, even if they're residential or non-residential, and then lower negative scores, and then again the reverse for those who are not active. So as far as implications for school psychology, I believe this study really provides some insights to the population that lacks understanding. I think when we see our kids, we kind of just see them as students in school, and you're here to learn and fix the problem, but we don't. I think this study kind of helps look at how can we address these 4 areas so that you can be successful in school. If you're struggling with things on the outside, trying to find a way to help best we can in the schools so that you can be successful and kind of overcome some of the hurdles that may be in front of you because of family concerns. Also allowing us to possibly use interventions in academic behavior, interventions for academic and behavior, as well as addressing the emotional side as well. And then lastly, the study provides an understanding of the African American and also other ethnic communities and how these variables can impact them. So in conclusion, basically the findings of this study contribute greatly to the literature. But there again are some lacks some information as far as looking at gender specifically and also race due to the limited variety in the population size. And while there was no significance found, which counters some of the predictions, the sample still provides information that could lead to further research on those dependent variables. Also mentioning some limitations for the particular study. Just some of the measures that were used. The other measures could have been used to kind of specify, to give a more continuous variable for sexual behavior, or to kind of get some variation in how we look at the variables altogether. I do have participants who were willing to volunteer. However, one thing that I kind of came into is the survey was a little long, so they kind of got halfway through and they stopped. So then, trying to have something that would be able to provide, more participation, which leads also to the sample size. Well, I did have 122 participants, maybe having a larger sample size that was again more diverse in both gender and race could have led to some different results that were seen. And also since I used a retrospective study, so they were trying to think back to, ages 13 to 17, if I was actually able to use current high school students and have them answer the questions based on what was going on right now, would have given some additional viewpoints, as well as kind of catching those students who, those who were academically successful, those who weren't, catching kind of a more variety of students than just those who have graduated high school and moved on to college. As far as for future research, again, trying to have a population size that kind of matched evenly across the board. So for age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, even conflict levels of relationship with their fathers. Additional research could be looking at mother absence. There's a lot of research for father absence and fatherlessness and how that affects them, but then also looking at mother absence. How does it have the same effect, or is it a different effect on these variables? Again, having high school students be the participants as opposed to college undergraduate students looking backwards. And then also looking at how having other support systems in your life can kind of help fill the void for the father being absent. And that's all. Any questions? Oh, one second. Before the questions. Sorry. I do want to, again, thank everyone for being here and being present. I'm very thankful to my committee for all the work that you've put in. I'm thankful for my support system back here that has been here to help me. I'm also very thankful for my mother and my grandmother who could not be here because they've kind of pushed me through everything. And that's why I'm here today. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you guys all for being here for her public defense. So we're gonna spend some time with her.